I appreciate you coming here to talk to me today. I was very interested in your book. I'm actually going to buy your book, and what I'm
Hmm.
going to do is
I've got it prepared here.
yes, I'm definitely going to buy that book because
Polish and
calligraphy.
English. Here are two, Polish and English.
And you know what?
And I made it all myself, including the cover, including the formatting, and now I am an owner. I've got like a publishing house, but on a one-person business, but I am a publisher here in Poland, so
that's
that's
awesome.
nice.
That's awesome.
I can publish all the books I want.
That's good. I'm pretty sure you're probably working on one right now, huh?
Actually, the problem with me is that I know so many topics and it's hard to pick up one which will be the first. And everyone is asking me, what would be my next book about? And I say, I don't know which one will appear first. So that's the
Right,
problem.
right. So, I think the best introductions, at least my introductions that I do for myself, are the best ones. I think I can speak the best for me. So, tell me a little bit about yourself.
Yes, I will introduce myself to everyone here. My name is Aleksander Czeszkiewicz, and I'm a researcher and, as you mentioned, author from Poland. Now I'm 21 years old, but as I mentioned, I published my book at 18. I wrote it at 17, and it all started in my middle high school. And because the entire educational system was to be changed when I was finishing my middle high school, it would be really hard for me to go for a good high school later on. So in order to be safe and secure, I attended a few competitions, and the most important ones were, of course, the historical competitions. And those competitions were on a very high level because if you achieved a high place in this competition, you can pick whatever high school you want in the entire Poland. So this was of a really high esteem competition. And because of that, I needed to learn actually an entire history from the prehistory, the Stone Age up until nowadays. And because of that, I was learning it holistically, each epoch, every epoch. And I was not only focusing on particular periods, but I needed to know the entirety, like a theory behind the history, a theory behind how we understand the past and how we understand the entire history. So because of that, I started learning more and more, and as I was learning, I started asking more and more questions. And it led me to this idea because I was always into like knowledge, understanding the universe also. And because I was also learning biology, genetics, I started, asking myself, is this what I was learning about history? All the history we know? Or could
Mhm.
it be that there is something more, but that we haven't discovered things
Right.
yet? And because I needed to learn tons of history, I also was learning about the history of science, of how our understanding of the reality was changing throughout the history. And I learned that, nowadays we say that, and this is a common knowledge, that the Sumerians were probably the first civilization, and that before that there were probably only settlements and cities. But this knowledge actually came about just in 1950s, so 70 years ago. And before that, our understanding of the history was completely different. And
Mhm.
actually, not only the Sumerian civilization, but any civilization from the Middle East, from ancient Mesopotamia, was not known until 1840s.
Mhm.
Only in the 1840s, we started rediscovering cities and civilizations from the area of ancient Mesopotamia. And before that, these civilizations were, of course, not included in our understanding of history. We thought that probably the Egypt was the first civilization, despite the fact that we had sources, we had a lot of sources describing civilizations, cities, etc., happening and existing on the area of ancient Mesopotamia. And that led me to, wanting to find more about it. And I was fascinated because if we know nowadays, if we know so many things about cultures like ancient Mesopotamia, we have so many Sumerian cuneiform records, etc. I wanted to find out what those ancient civilizations, what those first civilizations like Egypt, like
Mhm.
ancient Sumerian civilization in India, what they were thinking about our history. Because as I was learning the history of science and how the scientific method worked, I wondered if we have such a picture, but it was changing throughout the history. What was the picture of the past and understanding of the history in 3000 year BC? You
Right.
know what I mean? So I
Yeah.
started digging deeper and deeper, and I found all of those fascinating stories like the Epic of Gilgamesh, Sumerian King's List, Mahabharata, and
Mhm.
I actually started being into I'm actually mostly into ancient texts, maybe not
Yeah.
archaeology. I of course include that, but I am mostly into because this initial thing started fascinating me and I started digging deeper and deeper into those ancient texts which were describing so many fascinating things that were beyond my comprehension of how we can say that these people that were describing all of that and who wrote Mahabharata, the Vedas,
Mhm.
or Epic of Gilgamesh, how can we say that these people were so primitive, so uneducated, and how we can say that these people had such a limited view of the world, of the existence, while in their texts there is
Mhm.
much more to get to know about how they understood the universe. So it all happened back then when I was learning for the historical competition. And back then, actually, between like it was 14, 15, 16 years of age, I decided that, you know, everyone else, that was around me didn't know about it. Even most of the teachers didn't know about that stuff. The kids were not interested in it at all. So I wanted to publish a book to show all of those amazing things about our past and to show the potential that our past may have been something different than we think it is right now.
Right, right. And that's interesting you say that because I actually have some questions here on my
Mm-hmm.
monitor of stuff that from when I watch people's videos and read their books, I really digest what they say. I don't take it for being facts and I don't take it for being fiction.
Mm-hmm.
I try to research exactly what they said. And what I do is if I read somebody's book, and even if I agree with it, what I try to do is try to see where they got their information and how they got their information, right? I don't try to determine if they was right or wrong. There's a lot of arguments about individuals with their text. I mean, we don't even have to go further into that. But the point is that I try to research what the person says because we all have our own ways of doing research, right? I can't read every single book in the world. You can't read every single book in the world. The next person can't read every single book in the world. What we have to do is take the pieces of everything that we've read and have comparative study discussions like me and you are doing right now and people
Mm-hmm.
that you've had discussions in the past with. That's one of the reasons why I reached out to you because I've seen videos of you with other individuals talking about this stuff. And you talked about the Epic of Gilgamesh. And it's interesting because when I first did my research on the Epic of Gilgamesh, just like you said, it was what about 1840s is when they found the tablets, and I believe the guy's name was Hamad Razam or something like that. I can't remember his actual name. But when he found these tablets, and I'm trying to look it up because I had it up on my screen, but it closed down by accident. When he found these tablets of the Epic of Gilgamesh, I'm sure you heard of Andrew George, right? Andrew George is
Mm-hmm.
supposed to be the individual who was one of the guys who translated the text, and it's pretty interesting that he's respected for that, right? And the individual's name is Hormazd Razam, I think that's how he said it. And he found the tablets in what 1853 for the Epic of Gilgamesh. So I want to clarify that
Mm-hmm.
by myself. And when I read Andrew George's book that says that's about the Epic of Gilgamesh. He has in his introduction, he says basically in so many words, don't take it for fiction and don't take it for facts. Basically, you're going to have to try to digest it and read it and understand from other ancient texts, like you mentioned, like the Mahabharata, the Rig Vedas. You got the Mesopotamian, the Egyptian, you got the Japanese myths, the Chinese myths. And a lot of people don't realize that Chinese myth and Japanese myths are almost identical. You know, I've read where the lining and the mythologies within those two are very, very identical. It's just the names that may have changed, and minor stuff like everything else. You talk a lot about civilization, so I gotta ask you, because I don't think I've heard you say it, and maybe I haven't just seen the video that you said it. What is your favorite civilization out there, and why?
What is my favorite civilization? From ancient civilizations, I would either pick, depending on how it is my favorite, because if it would be my favorite for the text, maybe it would be ancient Sumerian civilization, or I would either say holistically civilizations from ancient Mesopotamia, because there were so many changes in their civilizations, and of course the later ones were taking the older knowledge, and in some of the texts from the Sumerian civilization haven't survived till our times, or we haven't discovered them yet, but we have from later civilizations copies of those texts, and we know that they are much older. So probably I would say civilizations from the ancient Mesopotamia would be my favorite one region and ancient civilization.
And that's awesome you say that, because my whole start on this thing, trying to learn and understand, began with the ancient Sumerians. The Sumerians, to me, is their mythology is so intriguing and so inspirational and so beautiful. The it's like okay, so stepping back to the Sumerians, going to the electronic text corpus of Sumerian literature. I'm sure you know about it. That's where you get all the Sumerian texts at, right? And then they have also the book that's what the ancient literature of Sumer, that gives you the same thing, the ancient texts of the Sumerians. And I've read both. I love the book hard copy version, but having access to the digital online is a beautiful thing. I want to ask you this: what do you think of Nibiru/Nibiru?
This is an interesting question. And I would say, because I've read not all, but like 3/4 of Zecharia Sitchin books, but I also read like other completely contrary to Zecharia Sitchin authors like Michael Heiser, etc. And I think that Nibiru is something different than Sitchin have envisioned. And interestingly, it is connected to what Sitchin was talking about, but it is like a different path to take. Because Sitchin was talking about, some huge orbit and huge orbital cycle, etc. But for instance, Michael Heiser found out that Nibiru, that the description of Nibiru from ancient Mesopotamia fits much more a star, not a planet.
Yeah.
But still, I think that the cycle, because Sitchin also connected the cycle of the orbit of Nibiru, the lost planet according to him, with the precession of the equinoxes. And I wrote about it at the end of my book when I mentioned cycles of time. If Nibiru is connected a little bit to the precession of the equinoxes, and if, according to Heiser, and if he is right, it is more likely a star than a planet, what if it is a binary star of our solar system? Because there is a theory that our solar system is a binary star system, that there is our sun and there is its twin, which would be most likely, I think, a brown dwarf, which cannot be seen very easily even with advanced telescopes, etc. And it may be because if we take a look at the precession of the equinoxes, one of the main theories about it is that there is some kind of wobble of Earth. But still, it is a theory, and there are some other theories which mention, for instance, traveling of our solar system throughout the galaxy, which, because of that, the zodiac signs on our horizon are changing. So there are a few theories, but what if it is about the Nibiru the extra star of our solar system, and what if it is about the motion of the solar system that is connected with this binary star system? So it is very, very advanced, but I don't think with our current technology that planet Nibiru is like a planet and it is described exactly like Sitchin described it. Or maybe, it is something completely different, like a planet that is completely out of the solar system, but is traveling in some weird ways. But I think it is beyond the scope of modern physics. So it is like that, but I'm more interested. I don't know if it is Nibiru. Some people call it that. Some people call it Maldek. I am very interested, and I think that it is a very credible idea that there was an extra planet in our solar system that was destroyed and became the modern asteroid belt between Mars and Jupiter. Because we have evidence that the asteroid belt was probably some kind of bigger body. Because even in the asteroid belt, we see, I think, two bigger bodies of mass of matter that may be the actual planet which was destroyed. And even in physics, we have some ideas of how this destruction happens. So it is, I think, more credible with our current knowledge about how solar system and how the universe works, that there could have been something, a planet, an extra planet, and who knows, maybe it is the Nibiru and maybe some beings actually existed there. If Mars was habitable a few million years ago, if I am right, a few millions or a few maybe billions of years ago, I don't know exactly, but if Mars was habitable, so why not the planet that was between Mars and Jupiter? So maybe this was the Nibiru.
Right. I have a lot of trouble believing the Nibiru planet idea, only because, like you said, you mentioned Dr. Michael S. Heiser. Both Zachariah Sitchin and Dr. Michael S. Heiser both passed away. Dr. Michael S. Heiser passed away.
Recently.
Yeah, passed away last year in February, I believe. And I enjoy his work just like I enjoy Zachariah Sitchin's work. I've read all of Zachariah Sitchin's book except like one of them, and I think it was only because it was mainly mythology, or not mythology, fiction that he implemented with his mythology, and I just didn't want to waste my time with that. But when I compare his notes, or even Dr. Michael S. Heiser's notes, to the electronic text corpus of Sumerian literature, I get a whole different idea of, who the Anunnaki were, or Anunas, or, Nibiru, or Nibru, as the Sumerians called it. I get these different ideas. One thing that I found interesting, and I want to bring this to attention because I know you do your research, and I just want to know if you ran across this. The Anuna, we know, are known as gods, right? The description is that they're great gods, they're powerful gods, they're basically the leaders of wherever they came from, right? And they found a new home in ancient Mesopotamia, in Egypt, right? Or Africa, I should say, right? But when I read the electronic text corpus of Sumerian literature, I just found this out recently, okay? And I bought this book a couple of years ago, and I don't know how I missed it, but I went back to read the book again, and I learned that the Igigi were known as great gods, and the Anuna were mentioned. And I have the book page and all that, and I can send that to you if you want me to. I actually posted it on my Twitter. I think I actually posted it on Facebook too, because I was kind of shocked by it. But when you go back to the hard copy of the ancient literature of Sumer, and you look at the descriptions of the Igigi and Anuna, they say that the Anuna were just known as gods, but the Igigi were known as, or Igigi, I've heard it said so many different ways, that they were considered great gods. But my question is why would great gods be toiling the earth and asking the Anuna / Anunnaki to create a new species to take over? That was kind of something that struck me.
I need to revise a little bit because I have also a few books on all of that with the glossary, which shows all the descriptions of all of those, like Igigi, Anunnaki, etc. But I've heard that our understanding of the ancient Sumerian mythology is still in constant change, and especially the biggest changes, and I think, were made in the 70s. I read like a book, Ancient Iraq by George Roux, and he mentioned that plenty of the understanding of, as you mentioned, those different kinds of beings, entities, whatever, our understanding of them changed a lot because we discovered, especially during the end of the last century, more and more sources. So it is like, for instance, with the Gnostic texts. The
Yeah.
Gnostic texts may tell us of the demiurge, but depending on different branch of the Gnostics, it means something different. It means maybe it is also an entity and has similarities, but some people say it is like that, others were saying it is like that. So I think this is the biggest problem. But of course, I know the basics, like Anuna
Mm,
means sky in the ancient, I don't remember which language, because there are lots of languages and
yeah.
there have been evolving over a lot. But that's why Anunnaki, they mentioned Sitchin was wrong in mentioning that Anunnaki is they who came from heaven to
Yeah.
earth.
Yeah.
But understanding it literally, Anuna and Ki Earth, Anuna sky and Ki Earth, it would be sky people, people from came from sky to Earth. So it all depends on the interpretation. It is also a very interesting topic to me, how we understand, how we interpret the data, because we do not know everything about the ancient cultures, what they meant, and in most of the cases, it is all about our interpretation of the data and what is the most plausible idea. But as I mentioned, at the end of the last century, we were starting to discover more and more cuneiform tablets, and
Mhm.
our understanding of these terms changed a little bit, or maybe more in some cases. So this is the problem. But as I mentioned, I don't use Sitchin as, quoting the ancient texts. I want to go to the sources, to the, scholarly translations of the ancient tablets or whatever ancient text. But I found some similarities between what Sitchin said. He said it differently, and between what was in the original text. And still, his theories about the Anunnaki and all of those crazy
Mm.
to understand it from the modern perspective, crazy stories. There are plenty of crazy stories when you read the original
Right.
ancient
Yep.
tablets about the floods, about the gods. So I think it is a very highly sophisticated topic, and it's ton of research to understand all of that correctly, which beings were what exactly.
Right. 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 I agree with you on that. Um, you mentioned about those who came from down to earth, Zachariah Sitchin. Um, I've read the book from his niece that published unpublished books from Zachariah Sitchin. And in the beginning of the book, it actually talks about how Zachariah Sitchin came up with that phrase. And it was interesting to know that he was in Sunday school as a young child who
Mm-hmm.
heard his teacher talk about the Nephilim, saying that they were giants. And then he said, he counted it and said, hey, doesn't this mean those who came from earth, from heaven to earth, right? And it was interesting to read that because for him to come up with that translation, that means he had to do a lot of studying. And it brings me back to what you did. Okay. I can't question Zachariah Sitchin on how he came up to that as a child because there are people such as yourself who were studying these things at a young age. Now, just because Zachariah Sitchin wasn't right about it, maybe he was confused or whatever, that's neither here or there. But I do find it interesting that he actually sparked interest in people to finding out the
Mm-hmm.
truth, right? Like nobody can deny that when the Anuna / the Anunnaki are mentioned, Zachariah Sitchin's name is going to come up. And I applaud him and thank him every day for that because that's what got me on my journey. I wouldn't even be in a position of writing a book if it wasn't for me reading his information because there wouldn't have been something about that caught my interest to want to research behind him, right? He wrote his book in what 1976.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a long time. Have you ever read anything from Anton Parks?
No, I haven't read, but I've heard of him, and
Yeah.
I've watched some of his like interviews, etc.
Okay, so I highly recommend you reading Eden from him, Anton Parks. He actually gives cuneiform tablet identifiers, and the reason why I'm going to tell you the reason why it's important. Um, he gives these tablet identifiers to what tablets he think where he got his translations from, and
Mm-hmm.
as most people like us who know about the Cuneiform Digital Library Initiative in the British Museum and so on and so forth, you can actually go in and look at these tablets, these cuneiforms for yourself with your own eyes, like as if you was there at the museum. And then in some cases, I remember a couple of years ago, I think it was Oxford who offered it. It's either Oxford or Pennsylvania. But when you go to their website, you know how they have all these tablets and stuff like that. They actually say if you can translate one of their tablets and they have somebody who can verify your translation, they will actually credit you for that, right? So that's one thing that I'm trying to do is I'm actually learning cuneiform so I can do that before my time is up. But I read Anton Parks, and I like how you said that new information is changing what we know about the Sumerians, or at least the Anuna slash the Anunnaki. And when I read Anton Parks' book, Eden, I get to certain parts in there where I get an idea. I believe it's cuneiform identifier K5157. And it says that basically that Enlil and Enki aren't always known as brothers, that Enlil is considered the father, or sometimes Enki is. And this is during the tablet K5157 that talks about this. So I was wondering, with the new information that we're getting today, right? Do you think we're getting closer to the truth, or do you think we're getting further from the truth?
The example of Enlil and Enki once being brothers and once not being brothers is a good example of why I prefer to be a generalist. Because if something general appears almost everywhere in 90% of the sources, most probably this is the case. But the more specialized we become and the more we want to know some minor details like Enki, Enlil, particular beings, the more confusion we got. Because as you mentioned, once he is his brother and once he's not. The same is, for instance, with Jesus, with all the Gnostic versions, the Bible, Apocrypha, etc. We don't know Jesus, Joshua, and how his life appears. There are contradictory stories about him. So that's the problem. The same is with, for instance, the Egyptian mythology. And it is a great example to compare with Enki and Enlil, because in Egyptian mythology, there are so many versions of a particular god that we often want to generalize that, for instance, Thoth was only god of wisdom, he introduced the script, etc. But there are so many different stories. Once he introduced it alone, once with his wife, and there are plenty of different stories of particular people, entities, etc. And there are so many of them that often they contradict each other or they are not connected with each other. So this is a problem, and that's why the first thing I want to do is to generalize, to see the patterns. For instance, the belief of ancient people in an older history, like Plato's Atlantis 9,000 years before Solon, Egyptian list of kings 36 about 1,000 years before the first pharaoh, the Sumerian kings list, much older history, the Hindu mythology, even millions of years ago in some cases. So I want to generalize and see the same pattern, the same with gods. I don't want to go into particular gods exactly, but if I see that, these gods here are connected with these gods there, or 7 sages are connected in ancient Mesopotamia, ancient India, and in a few other regions, then I think that there is something to it. There may be some fact, there may be some truth to it. And that's why I sometimes prefer to stay in general terms, because the more you get into, the more you get confused. As you mentioned, maybe we discovering more doesn't mean that we get closer to the truth. Especially, I'm not against science, but I am a critic of science. The scientific method wants to get an objective view of everything, but an objective view does not always mean the true view, the truth, because we want to stay as objective as possible, and you deny that because there's only one source and there are 10 sources for something different. The same with the studying only material reality, while there may be something metaphysical, non-physical to our reality. So that's the problem, that we need some type of method to distinguish, to sort things out. And I think that, modern scholars are not always good at it because, only with our logical minds, we do not have a possibility to grab the truth. We can think of something which is logical, but sometimes two scenarios are logical. Which one is true, we do not know. And maybe something completely different happened. It is the same as I mentioned, comparing our history to a murder mystery. We think that what we have, all the evidence, all the artifacts and stuff that survive, this is the history. And we create a picture, an interpretation of the stuff we have based on them and not based on what is, what isn't there. And what if it is like murder mystery? What if the murderer wanted to lead us astray and, hid some evidence or changed something, fabricated something? And what if the history is like that? And another question which I cover in my book is the degradation of stuff, which is really, really quick. And we think that we know so much, but even conservative archaeologists and historians, like for instance Zahi Hawass, he mentions that probably about 70% of ancient Egypt is still undiscovered, still lies beneath the sands. So if he, as a conservative Egyptologist, is saying that, so imagine there could be like 90% of Egypt still undiscovered or even more. So that's the problem with our understanding of history, that there are not many things. We think that, oh, we have so many tablets, but how many more there were and ceased to exist, were destroyed or something? Or even we think that the material evidence is the best, but even nowadays we are recording this conversation, but if we were just talking to each other, not recording, our conversation would be totally forgotten. Maybe I won't share what we talked about to anyone, maybe you or not want to talk about it, etc. And I think that lots of our history, and we see that on our everyday basis, that we do not know what happened exactly yesterday. It is hard for us to distinguish. So how can we know what was happening in ancient Sumerian civilization, ancient Egypt, etc.? That is hard, and I think that large part of our civilization is like mental, is about talking, and is very elusive and is often forgotten and is destroyed as times go by.
Right. I got a caveat on what you said. Because we don't know the actual facts and we don't know the truth, and it's impossible to actually know exactly what happened. The best bet we have is what is recorded in history. I know that during those times when people were recording on cuneiform tablets, they were taught how to do that in school. And school was very important to them, right? And sometimes they would get things wrong and they would get disciplined, and it's written in exactly how they talk about it. Like some people would have to bribe the teachers so their child could get favoritism and stuff, like just no different than what it is today, right? I have to ask you something, because we talked about civilization, we talked about ancient. I heard you talk about advanced civilizations and so on and so forth. What is the criteria that you believe is needed to be considered a civilization?
When it comes to the official history, the history is defined as all the time after the invention of writing, after the invention of script. So even though maybe the early ancient Sumer was a civilization, but they didn't have any script, it wasn't a civilization. It was like, we may say, country or a, capital with many different cities. So this is for the historical period, and civilization is often described with this history, that what started history were the civilizations. So most probably the invention of writing and all the social stuff, we may say. But the problem is that we think from our modern perspective, because nowadays writing and talking is so important to us that we think that it may be something that describes and that denotes the civilization. But for instance, Plato, in one of his dialogues, was mentioning that when Thoth, the Egyptian god of wisdom, gave ancient Egyptians the first script,
Mm-hmm.
all the memories started vanishing because people were writing down everything and they didn't need to memorize anything. And I I always point out to having an imagination, and it is so important because what if there were advanced civilizations with no writing?
Right.
What if writing was of no use to them? They
Right.
were memorizing everything, they were communicating differently, or maybe they were even, as in Mahabharata or other ancient stories, they were so psychic that they were talking telepathically or
Right.
with some PSI extrasensory perception. It could be like that, and that's why I think, and my criteria for a civilization would be just someone with a society, so some group of people living together with different houses, with maybe some kind of social structure, some kind of buildings, and not temporary buildings, but buildings that last for at least 1 or 2 generations. And not like nomads. That would be a civilization,
Right.
like something a little bit bigger than a settlement, maybe with a little bit of social structure. But I won't say that it needs a script or a writing system or something like that.
When you said your idea of what you thought of civilization is, this of course comes from your own research and your own opinion. Um, I chose Oxford. My first article that I wrote on my website, rebirthoftheword.com, was Sumerians, the first civilization. And I titled that for a reason. And the reason why is because upon my research, I went through Oxford because Oxford is very popular with their ancient texts and stuff. I wanted to go to that
Mhm.
people who translated the text and understand their definition of a civilization because I wanted to know why they considered Sumerians one of the first civilizations. And I actually put it in my book, and I said, according to Oxford University, a civilized, or not my book, my article, a civilization is a stage of social development identified by the formation of organized communities. You mentioned that in
Mhm.
your own way, and permanent settlements. You mentioned that in your own way,
Mhm.
with oral and written records and history. You mentioned that in your own
Mhm.
way. Traditions, religious faith, laws, shared values, customs, beliefs, and artistic achievements. You basically mentioned it. And that I'm not
Mhm.
sure, and I'm not questioning your intelligence or nothing. I'm not sure if you already knew the Oxford definition or if that was part of
No,
the
no.
reason why, but that right there helps with the part that we're both looking at because that gives us a
Mhm.
common ground
Yes.
on what we both consider a civilization, right? And the reason why I bring this up is because Atlantis was a topic of yours that you spoke about, right?
Mhm.
Spoke about Thoth, and we know about Thoth supposedly coming from Atlantis and all this, that, and the third. And it's interesting to me because I have all of Plato's books, right? Or all the ones that are available to the general public, right? He has a lot of books.
Mhm.
They're very long. I actually have it on my Kindle. And the reason why I have it on my Kindle is because I like to source my material. See, you already see how I like to do these books, how I do my little tabs and everything. So I was like, and it was only like $1.99. So I was like, instead of paying $50, $60 for a book,
Mhm.
I'm just going to throw in my library. I put it on my Kindle and I can reference it very easy whenever I want to. And he actually has a portion of in his book that's called, I don't know how to say it, so bear with me. It's like Cratylus, Cratylus. And that's basically the origins of words, his way of identifying etymology, right? Understanding the
Mhm.
origins of each word and stuff like that. So I really enjoy Plato's books, and it's fascinating that you said that because when it comes to Atlantis, there's a lot of mystery there, just like there is with the Sumerians, but there's more mystery with them because the Emerald tablets are popular. There have been a lot of individuals who wrote books about them. I won't mention their name because I don't want to get into what they said versus what is right and wrong or whatnot. But when I read the Emerald tablets from what's his name, Maurice Durrell, the guy
Mhm.
who actually said he got the information from Thoth himself, and so on and so forth. Um, I've heard individuals because you mentioned Jesus. There are people who equate Jesus, Thoth, and other people like Krishna and so on and so forth as
Mhm.
being the same individual. What is your idea about that? Because when it comes to Atlantis, and I'll make this really quick because I asked you a quick question. I don't want you to forget it. When it comes to Atlantis, what do you believe Atlantis was, and where do you think it came? Where do you think the location was at?
Mhm. Yes, as I mentioned, during the last few hundred years, we were taking the roots of our civilization back so many times. Firstly, we believed that ancient Greece and Rome were the first. Then we discovered with the Napoleon expedition to Egypt that Egypt was older. Then we discovered ancient Mesopotamia and ancient Sumerian civilization. So we're taking the first civilization so many times that
Mm,
I think that it is very probable or possible at least that in like a few decades we will take that to maybe Atlantis or some other previous civilization, whatever we may call, because there are so many things to be still discovered. We haven't, dig up everywhere on our planet, and
mm,
that's why I am not that, oh, Atlantis existed and others or mainstream is stupid not to include it. No, my opinion on Atlantis is that there are so many possibilities when it comes to our past, and that we have discovered just a tiny fraction of all of that,
mhm,
and we should be open for an existence of something before that. And especially if we have not only Atlantis but also many other texts mentioning that our civilization is either older or that ancient civilizations were the descendants of some older civilization, maybe like Atlantis. And I also do not consider that Plato in his dialogues Timaeus and Critias told us everything true about Atlantis. But I think that with so many information and with so many that are consistent with other ancient texts, that at least there is a grain of truth in it, maybe a bigger grain of truth about all of this lost history of humanity. And I think that Atlantis, when it comes to location, and if it existed, in that form, because I think that, the Atlantis being 9,000 years before Solon may just be a reference to some just other civilization that was much
right.
older. We think, oh, that if Plato said that, it must be like circular and it must be there and it must be 9,000 years before Solon. But I am more of a generalist.
Right.
And I think that just like some other civilizations were telling us that the history is older, the same is here with Plato. And I think that if Plato is telling us of so many geographical details, I think that Atlantis was somewhere on the Atlantic Ocean. But it doesn't exclude, for instance, the Bahamas, which are still within the enclosure of the Atlantic Ocean, or like some people mention Antarctica or some other possible locations, but somewhere on the Atlantic, because what I found out, and I made an extensive presentation on that recently, is that Plato was telling us the whole geography of half of the hemisphere of the Earth, because he mentioned that the Atlantis was outside of the Pillars of Hercules,
Mm,
so the Gibraltar, and he mentions in his dialogues that it was not the Mediterranean, it was the Oceanos, the ocean, so the Atlantic Ocean, which was called like that. And he mentioned that the Atlantis was on the opposite of the Pillars of Hercules, so outside the Mediterranean, and he mentioned that there was a huge ocean and that this ocean was surrounded by a continent. And if we take a look at the map, if we wanted to head out of the Mediterranean through the Straits of the
mhm.
Gibraltar, so the Pillars of Hercules, it would look like the both Americas and the Middle America are surrounding the Atlantic
Yeah,
Ocean.
I'm seeing it
It would
now.
look like that. So most probably Plato was also mentioning here the Americas. It is very probable, why not? And there are also many more mysteries about the pre-Columbian discoveries of the Americas. But if Plato is telling us of this entire geography, why some skeptics are telling us that Atlantis most probably was somewhere on the Mediterranean
Yeah.
Sea, like it was some Thera volcano that erupted and destroyed it. When Plato is telling us of the entire geography, he's not telling us some clues that, some vague descriptions, but he's telling us the entire geography. He's showing us the map of where the Atlantis was located. The same with saying that Atlantis was 9,000 years before Solon.
Yeah.
And it's very interesting because we have a few accounts. I think it was Plutarch and Herodotus who were telling us that Solon really went for travels to Egypt. And we know that plenty of ancient Greek philosophers and other, people of high esteem were traveling to Egypt at that time. So Solon most probably visited Egypt, and according to Plato, it was there at the Temple of Size that he was told the story of Atlantis. And some story of a civilization 9,000 years before is similar, for instance, to the lists of kings from ancient Egypt, which are telling us that, the history is much, much older, maybe some 30,000 plus years before ancient Egypt. So I think it is very plausible. And maybe because some people say that Plato imagined the entire, skeptics are saying that Plato imagined the entire story of Atlantis, which is a complete false statement because he most probably used an existing sources, because even the name Atlantis, it is in ancient Greek written like in English, Atlantis, and this mention of Atlantis was used even before Plato. For instance, Hellanicus of Lesbos has a poem which is very damaged, only a little bit of it survived, but there is a mention of the same name Atlantis. So whatever. So Plato didn't invent the entire story of Atlantis. Maybe he added something, some allegory, for instance, when it comes to the destruction of Atlantis, etc. But most probably, and for sure, he used some existing stories, maybe the true stories from Solon, which came from ancient Egypt, who knows? So that's the biggest problem of the skeptics, that they are one-dimensional. I would say that it is either true or false, and if it is most probably false, it is a whole imagination of Plato. It is similar to what I mentioned about Plato telling us of the Egyptian god of wisdom Thoth. He mentioned the same as ancient Egyptians, that god of wisdom Thoth introduced the hieroglyphic script to ancient Egyptians. He mentioned that, but his conclusion that, this further led to loss of memory by people. This may be allegorical, but based on true sources, on true legends. And I think that it is the same with Atlantis, that it is based on some earlier stories about this lost civilization, but maybe Plato added something, how Atlantis was destroyed or how it fought with prehistoric Athenians, etc. So this is the problem of Atlantis, and I think that, as I mentioned, I am for a possibility, and I think that we haven't discovered many things yet. There are many things to be discovered, and just as we thought that Troy was just an imagination, and I think that Troy was even in a much more fictional tale than Plato's dialogue, because Iliad and Odyssey of Homer, I think that these are much more epic and much more like fictitious stories than the actual dialogues of Plato based on true stories. So if we found Troy, I think that we may be up to finding Atlantis soon too.
I like how you put that, because that, just like you said, technology gets better, our information gets better. There's cuneiform tablets, thousands of them, that haven't even been translated. I'm sure there's Greek manuscripts that haven't been translated. I know for sure there's a lot of Rig Veda that hasn't been translated, because they said that no one can read it, because no one can read the full Rig Veda, because there are portions of it that are still untranslated. And I like how you say that, and I like this. I love this discussion, because one thing that stood out to me is that you don't like absolutes, right? You hate when somebody says, "Hey, this is it," and leave it at that, right? I can tell, because you speak in a way of, "Hey, this is what I've learned, this is what I've researched, and this is what I'm sharing." And then I get this sense and this feeling from you that later on, when you're presented with new information, you can even say, "Hey, I was wrong on this." I see that happening, because the way you're speaking as if you're really trying to get to the bottom of it. My favorite scholar is Godfrey Higgins. He wrote these books in the 1700s, 1736. He wrote Anacalypsis Volume 1 and Volume 2, and then he wrote his Celts book. And those are three of my favorite books. They're really thick books. They're very, he gives you details of details of details, and he goes into it really hard. And he says, what I like about him, and I aspire to do what he does, is since I'm retired, And like I said, one of my favorite historians is Godfrey Higgins. But the father of history is, you mentioned, Herodotus, right? And he does have plenty of books, and I have all his books too. That's available to the general public on my Kindle also. And I've read his books, and he gives these very good descriptions of all kinds of stuff, how he went to certain places and how he researched the information he got, just like how we do today. When people go to some of these locations, they talk to the indigenous people there and get their side of the oral traditional story that they got, because that's all myth is. When I hear the word mythology, when I hear the word myth, I don't hear it as fiction like 90% of the people that I've had discussions with. Um, I hear that it's just a traditional oral story, because when you look up the definition, that's literally one of the first
Mm-hmm.
definitions in most cases, the first definition that describes what a myth is. So oral traditional stories doesn't mean that it's fiction. I mean, there is a
Mm-hmm.
definition that fits that, yes, but it's not the main definition, because like you said, and just like we talked about earlier, our times of understanding of things change, right?
Mm-hmm.
Etymology of words will change, the origins will always be there, but the meaning of what we are at today will be different than what it was in those archaic times. Like you mentioned the word scholars. Something that I learned about scholars was that that could have meant anybody who researched their material, right? Prime example, we mentioned Dr. Michael S. Heiser. Well, just a few days ago, I was doing a deep dive. I do a lot of research, and one thing that I keep by my desk is I keep a dictionary by my desk along with a thesaurus and stuff like that, because when I try to understand the actual meaning of the words that people use. And because I have a brain injury from being wounded in combat, I have to make sure that I go back and understand what I'm being told, and I can't be emotional with what my research and all this other stuff. So it's important for me. But, you know, going to the origins of all this stuff is very interesting to me, just because when you have to think of how these people were thinking in those times. You can't look how we live today and be like, well, they would have done it this way, they would have done it that way, or this, that, and third. It doesn't matter, because you don't live in those time frames, right? They did things that was easier for them. It might have been harder, but it could have been easier, because sometimes doing things the hard way is easy for some people. I don't know why. I learned the hard way. Like a lot of stuff that I've learned is coming from people like you. You guys say something, I read your guys' book. I've done podcast discussions with not Michael, with Michael Cramo. Do you know who that is? The author
Mm-hmm.
of Forbidden
Yes, yes.
Archaeology. I've done a discussion with him. I actually done discussions with Dr. Sasha Lesson. I'm not sure if you know who that is, but he was a friend and student of Zachariah Sitchin. And I've done 10 podcast discussions with him. So I got deep insight of what he had shared to his class and his friends than what wasn't written in books. I've done discussions with uh, Jeff Benner. I'm not sure if you know who that is, the renowned Hebrew scholar, Jeff Benner. I've learned so much from different people, and it's from you guys that I understand that you, when you do your due diligence, you help me guide me through my path and understanding what is what. And what I like about you is just I've noticed that you don't like absolutes. There are a lot of people out there who talk about absolutes. Like when we was talking about the emerald tablets, people will say these are real. It's nothing fake about it. It's absolutely
Mm-hmm.
true, and that's the end of it. And I feel that does a disservice for people like you and me, because in the essence of that, if you think about it, if somebody makes an absolute and they say this is the truth and this is the facts, then your research no longer matters, right? It only
Mm-hmm.
matters if you agree with them, right? That's the
Hmm.
only way it matters, is if you agree with them. But if you don't agree with them, then it doesn't matter, right? Because they're
Mm-hmm.
saying that this is what I did through my research. This is the time that I spent doing this, that, and the third, and I know my stuff, and nobody else can change my mind. Well, if that's the case, then you we're basically at a dead end with your knowledge, because you're no longer furthering the idea that there could be something possibly else. Now, when you mentioned Antarctica and Atlantis, I actually did a podcast discussion with three gentlemen, two engineers at that. And I've read Plato's books. I've uh I've done deep dives. When we had these discussions, I actually got on Google Earth, right? In the middle of our discussion, it's on Twitter. I posted it on YouTube. And in the middle of our discussion, I was just messing around and I found an actual headquarters of Antarctica, right? And you could tell that it was set up for us to see it, first of all, because they're not going to hide things in plain sight for us without us telling a story. And what I mean by that is they have a headquarters there, right? They had a coffee machine, they had a chair, but you could tell nobody was walked in there. You know, you could see dust movements, you could see the little particles, you could see the carpet being disturbed if somebody was walking. There's certain things you can see if you pay attention to detail on if it was set up or not. And there's a lot of mysteries in there. I'm sure you know about Admiral Byrd and his idea of flying into the, the idea and all this stuff. When I hear the Anuna slash the Anunnaki, I don't necessarily believe they came from planet Nibiru. I don't know what Atlantis is and where is it at because there's minimum information on that. I just know, the two books that Plato actually talks about it, which you mentioned, Timaeus and Critias. And I'm not sure if I don't think I remember catching anything from Herodotus in his books. I can't remember offhand, but of course I don't have it in front of me right now. But it's interesting to know that when you get to Atlantis and you get the different ideas of Atlantis, when you get to the origins of it, let me ask you something. Do you hold science on a high regard, or do you hold science accountable when they get misinformation wrong? And do you acknowledge that when, like, for instance, let me backtrack. You know how they talk about how they have AI that can generate the ancient texts and translate it so for us to understand. Mm-hmm. Do you think that AI is going to help us better that translation, or do you think that humans are still going to have to go behind it and do it so that way we get a better understanding? Like, I'm trying to understand the science part of what you think is useful and what you think is not useful for this part.
Mm-hmm. Yes, it's interesting because I have experience. I translated my book. I will show for other people because I haven't showed to others. So Polish and English, and I translated from Polish to English. And I have to say that, if you want to just translate for the meaning, and I could do that at the beginning, it is so easy. And any AI probably nowadays, because there weren't that many AIs when I was translating, most AIs would be able to translate my book into English and preserve most of the meaning. Maybe you only need to correct something after them. But the biggest thing when translating the book and you want for it to be readable is to make it like with flow, because the translation with algorithm and the exact meanings of words will be so disruptive for you. You read one sentence and the other isn't connected to it. There is no connection between each other. It's hard to read. But when it comes to ancient texts, I think the main idea is understanding the true meaning of them. So I think AI won't have problem translating them. The only thing, and it is still with plenty of translations that I read, some words are, explained below in some footnotes that they may mean a few different things. But I think AI could manage to do that too. So AI translating texts won't be a problem because all the language and all the stuff is algorithmic. So I think it won't be a problem with that. And so that's it when it comes to that. But I will talk a little bit about science, and you mentioned about the absolutes. I believe there is an absolute truth out there and some absolute, our past happened in a particular way, but we just don't know how it happened. There was some truth, just as now I am here, it is happening in a way. So there is a way for things to happen. And I think that it happened in a way. Maybe it was about Atlantis, but I think that we do not know much. It is like Socrates, the more I know that I don't know. And it was my experience with reading tons of books. I have like tons of maybe about 800 books or something, physical like books here in my room. I haven't counted them yet, but something about that. And the more I learn and the more I read, the more I know that I don't know things. And this is crazy. And I think that nowadays, lots of people, if you mention strong opinions, it is all about our intellectual arrogance. We think that, it is one thing, as I mentioned with debunking Plato. We can point 2 or 3 things that are most probably false, but we don't know for sure either way, and we may debunk it altogether because why not? And I'm against such an arrogance, and this arrogance is seen, it's like intellectual arrogance. It's a little bit like, I often compare it to the story of satanic pride, but I won't get into it here. But it is like arrogance that we know so much because we see everything from our modern perspective.
Yeah.
We see all the technological development which is booming, so we trust that if technology is booming, so we are on a much higher position than, for instance, our ancient ancestors who were primitive, stupid, etc. But it is only because of our point of view of everything, and it is very arrogant, prideful, and very being superior to others because of all the discoveries. And that's why, as I mentioned, I'm not against totally science, but I am against science having a monopoly on knowledge, because I think knowledge is much more. That's why, okay, pseudoscientist, there's a term pseudoscientist for everyone who is not agreeing with the scientific method. Okay, I accept that I am not a scientist myself, but why are you calling everyone outside of science like, okay, pseudoscientist, but it is often negative pseudoscientist, like, so hoax, etc. It is very bad because people start believing in science, that science is the only way to truth. But even in the definition, you mentioned lots of definition, even the definitions of science, there are many of them, but if you generalize them, the definition of science isn't that science is searching for truth. Science is searching to explain the
Yes.
material world, only the material world. One of the axioms, so like for our audience, axioms like basic premises that we accept as true. For instance, one of the premise may be that things exist. We accept that we exist, all the stuff exists. If we accept that it doesn't exist, we shouldn't bother making science, you know what I mean. And one of the basic axioms, which is true for science, is that only matter and its interactions, so all the forces, fields, etc., exist, nothing other. But we know that a big bang probably happened and made our universe, but our universe is only the material part. But what if there is something more than that? Science is only focused on the material part. That's why I'm against science having monopoly on knowledge. And we see that for, calling everyone who is, outside of science, like some hoax guru, etc. For instance, maybe energetic or spiritual healing is true, but science is saying, oh, we do not have evidence. But what if it is outside of matter? You know what I mean? What if, because science wants to find the process of how the, so-called quantum healing, etc. There are gurus telling you that it exists. Maybe it exists. There are some miracles in our reality, but what if it is completely outside of science? Maybe it has some like effect on matter, that it is healing us physically also, but what if it's this outside of it? And the best example is, for instance, 5G and Wi-Fi, etc. Science is telling us that, oh, it is only making us a little bit different, but what if there is a deeper level of that, like some spiritual, etheric, energetic level, you know what I mean? And it doesn't need to be material at all. So this is my problem with science. I believe in absolute truth, but I still, I accept plenty of possibilities, and I often talk about plenty of possibilities. I debunk the possibility that Plato imagined Atlantis because we have evidence that he most probably took earlier sources, and most probably he, made those from the visits of Solon to Egypt. But it doesn't mean that I say that Atlantis 100% sure existed in that way. Maybe it existed, maybe it didn't, but the fact is that most probably the Atlantis story is much older than Plato and existed before that. But there are plenty of possibilities. Maybe there was one Atlantis, maybe two, maybe it was a different date than Plato, maybe a different location, maybe it was meaning something different. But the fact is that it is not Plato who imagined the story of Atlantis. And I mention possibilities because we see how science evolved and how our understanding of our past evolved. That we thought that Greece was the first civilization, then Egypt, then Sumer, so why not in the future Atlantis or Lemuria or some other civilization. And that's my problem with science, that science wants a monopoly on knowledge, and it is a paradigm, because if you believe that science can explain everything, it is your belief. What if it cannot explain everything? Science is limited. It has its axioms, like the materialistic, it is called like, it is materialism in general, but there are different parts of materialism. But it is accepting materialism as true. But what if materialism isn't true? Or materialism is a bubble within some bigger reality. So that's the problem, and that's why I am completely for possibilities when it comes to our past.
Right, right. I write down these discussions that I have with individuals all the time, because I feel like, we like you said earlier, when I told you I would send you 10 questions, you was like, hey, I'll just go with the conversation, with the flow of conversation. So the monopoly of knowledge, I believe, can happen if people don't research what is behind AI. And that's why I mentioned, do you think it will help us? Because I think it will help us get an idea, kind of alleviate some of the 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 time needed to actually, research the stuff yourself, because AI is going to say, like, if you look at the symbol of Anu, you know what Anu symbol is, and that could mean sky, it could mean God, it could mean so many different things, and you can put that in there. But AI will be able to take that and put that into a sentence where we can understand. It's just like with Grammarly. I know you're an author. I'm not sure if you use Grammarly, but sometimes when I write in my book and I try to write it the way I wanted to say it, Grammarly will say, hey, you might want to say it this way because it will make more sense. And I will go back and I'll actually compare it. Like, if something doesn't make sense, if I write it in the words that I'm trying to explain it, and then I go back and edit it later. But I've noticed that, like, sometimes with Grammarly, if I have it change it one way, if I close that program down for at least 24 to 48 hours and get back to it, it will make me change it to something else, and then it'll make me change it to something else, because AI is saying, hey, no, that doesn't sound right, this sounds better. And it's almost like I'm resetting its brain by turning off the program itself and giving it a break and coming back to it. So I believe AI will help us, and I really enjoy that. I like how you mentioned the Big Bang Theory, because I actually read a book about that, and it's kind of interesting. And I want to get into that for a second. So we know that the Big Bang Theory is about the idea of how the universe was created, right? We understand that there's so many theories about that, but when we're talking about origins and how we've been talking about the last hour about origins, I wanted to know, how did that term come to about, right? So I actually bought a book, and I learned that it was about Georgie Lemaitre. I think that's how you say his name, George Lemaitre. I'm not sure the exact way how to say it, but he came up with the idea of what's called the primeval atom, which is how the universe started off from one single explosion, and then when the universe expanded, it kind of cooled down, and that's where we got the universe of today. And then he had this individual named Fred Hoyle that didn't believe in the same theory that George Lemaitre believed in. And he actually Fred Hoyle went on BBC Radio or the television show. I've read two different sources. The book says radio, and then I've read another source that says TV, but it could have been TV radio, because back then that's how they labeled it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And he got on there and he said that, in basically trying to shoot down George Lemaitre's idea of primeval atom theory, he called his theory the Big Bang Theory. So we get the term Big Bang Theory from Fred Hoyle. Fred Hoyle comes up with that term trying to dismiss George Lemaitre's idea. At one time, Albert Einstein actually dismissed his idea, and later kind of came around to it. So that right there is interesting, because in 2024, we still use some of his George Lemaitre's ideas. Even we use Fred Hoyle's too, even though it's almost like Fred Hoyle was the Dr. Michael S. Heiser of Sitchin. That's who Fred Hoyle was, right? So learning about the Big Bang Theory and how the universe came to be, it's interesting to know that that comes from we get an idea of a full creation story from the Enuma Elish, which is a Babylonian mythology that possibly came from the Sumerians, but is written in some Sumerian cuneiform script, which is very interesting. I bring this up because when I go to ancient literature of Sumer, the book from that's the same source as the electronic text corpus of Sumerian literature, when I turn to the back of it, and even on the electronic text corpus of Sumerian literature, it tells you that most of the stuff that's written about the Anuna slash the Anunnaki came from the time period of 18th century BCE, which is not officially the time of when their first writing system started, which is 30 anywhere from 3200 BC to anytime you want to think from that period. And when you read the Enuma Elish, when you read in the Babylonian from the Sumerian cuneiform script and stuff like that, you get the sense of, because we talked about Nibiru and Jupiter and so on and so forth. I know the Babylonians considered Nibiru as Jupiter sometimes, and they also Marduk and all. I mean, there's so many different things. I want to ask you something. When you research your information, what is the first thing that you do when you put your book down and you're trying to figure out how to go about researching the material that you just read? Like, what pops in your head?
I'm actually never reading only a single book on the topic. So I just, I don't accept anything for granted. I just read
Okay.
it as an information. And that's why I'm generalist. I like to connect the dots. And that's why I'm always sometimes talking a little bit chaotic and in an interdisciplinary matter, because I think it is more important than just to specializing on something than to discover that it may be wrong. For
Right.
instance, if you was only to read and deeply investigate Zecharia Sitchin's works and analyze every line and all of that, and you would be, wow, I'm so good at it, I know everything. And then we would realize that some of it, or even most of it in some cases, is false. So that's why I'm not into that. It is like there are paradigm shifts even in science, and some things are changing even nowadays. That's why I read everything as a theory, as a thought, because I believe that we do not know the exact truth. I even think that we know the laws, for instance, we know the basic laws of physics, and we can model them, and we can, for instance, make a catapult that would, shot on a particular spot, for example, or some gun that will shot exactly then, because we can calculate all the wind,
Yeah.
all the gravity, etc. You know what I mean? And we can do that very precisely. But I think that these are still only, we see the world outside and we are modeling it for our own laws, and we use some, for instance, G-force, we use some numbers, some pi, etc. But I think that there is a code, like in the matrix, that our reality is based, like the laws are based on the actual code. And science is not getting the exact code, it is only getting an approximation of it. And I am for going for the truth. So I would prefer to get to know the exact code of the matrix, and all of our physical problems would actually cease to exist, and all of the physics would be complete if we knew how, for instance, like in a video game, how an engine is actually developing the game, the word, what algorithm, how it works. If we knew that, we can actually manipulate everything in matter, we can understand everything in matter. And the problem with us is that we are primitive, actually. We may think that we are all so advanced beings, we have all the technology, but we are so primitive because we only mimic the outside world, the material world, and we think that, oh, this is it. And I think this is the biggest misconception of people who like science, who say, oh, only science will help us. Oh, science is so advanced. Science knows so much that it can exclude some possibilities. Like skeptics say that we know so much about the history that we can exclude the existence of Atlantis. For instance, like on the latest Graham Hancock versus Flint Dibble debate, that we know so much about the archaeology of the times of Atlantis and the last ice age that we can completely exclude any possibility. But we do not know. We do not know the truth. We know what is still survived when it comes to the history. And when it comes to the physics, we know what we analyzed, but there may be many more layers to the reality. Like we, for instance, see only particular electromagnetic spectrum. We hear only particular waves, but we do not hear other. Of course, physics is using some apparatus that can go beyond our vision, like in infrared and other, other electromagnetic spectrum. But still, I think that because we are wired as humans, we are only mimicking everything we are seeing. And this is the biggest problem with finding the absolute truth and with science, that science is only like trying to, it is actually often called modeling the world. Science is a model of the world outside of us, but only the material world. So why are we talking about, in science, searching for truth, etc.? It's only a model, and we should accept that. And the problem is that many people believe that science is like the ultimate vision of the reality, but it is only a model, and only model of the material part of the reality. And what was the original question? I forgot. I want to conclude with that. I wanted to, can you say?
Just basically like okay, how can I put
After
it?
I read a book, what it was that, yeah?
Yeah.
What I do after I read a book. So as I mentioned, and because I understood that, because I was so into the history of science, philosophy of science, I even don't take for granted like physics books, etc., because I know that, for instance, the physics books with all the equations that are true to some extent, because we can model some engine, for instance, on that, or some aeroplane. But I still see that through the lens that it is a model of reality. So I don't take it for granted, because it's like with Newton's laws. We still apply them, but we know that they are only a bubble within a larger picture of quantum reality, etc. And we know that, for instance, now on this level that we are for cars, etc., we do not use quantum something, right? Or, but for GPS, we need to use, I think, the relativity of time, because it would be a little bit off a few meters if we don't use that, because I think there is some shift in space, because the Earth has so much matter that it is shifting the space-time according to Einstein's some laws, etc. So this is the problem, and that's why I try to read many books, and I try to compare them, compare like physics, compare them with any other stuff. And that's the problem of the specialists, and going and making your career around a one topic, because it may be that in 50 years your topic won't be relevant anymore. And it is true the case, because here Poland, for instance, was under the communists until 1989, so very recently. And some people who were, for instance, studying and were graduates of 70s and 80s, they were learning completely different things. And nowadays they are either irrelevant, and we often say that there were some theories that were, for instance, Marxist, and they were to some extent accurate, but unfortunately they were proven wrong. But still, some of the assumptions, and this is an illusion, because, for instance, we may say that the Newtonian laws are true, but in some cases the quantum stuff is true and is relevant. And that's the problem, and that's why I think we should be generalists. And I am often doing first skimming everything, like not reading when it comes to books, skimming, and I skim like 5 or 10 books at a time. Then I read them very quickly, and then maybe at the end I read them in depth if I see that there is some potential. Because if I see that book is not relevant for anything that is relevant, why should I bother that? Like in science, there are plenty of irrelevant things, and our ancient ancestors were telling us of a thing called the necessity. It is a similar thing to karma and dharma in Hinduism. Necessity is basically that there are some absolutes in our reality, but some absolute, there is some truth. But in our intellectual arrogance, we think that we can do whatever we want. We can take any path we want, or we can take any decision we want. But the problem is that some decisions in a particular situations will be right and some will be wrong. And this was necessity, that some way of living will be right, some decisions will be right. It is in the Gnostic text, in the Hermetic Hermetic texts especially. It is a very important concept, similar to dharma, not karma, dharma in Hinduism.
Yeah.
What is right, what is lawful? It is distorted in the Hinduism that if you are in a particular caste, you should be a slave, for instance. It is distorted, but the idea that if I have my capabilities, if I'm good at something, like the Japanese ikigai, if you are good at something, if people like it, if you can live with it, you can earn money with it, then go for it, because it is the biggest service to others, to the world around us. But with all the material science, with all the atheism, believe that, everything is random, we are just biological machines. The problem with our societies is that we are prideful and arrogant because, okay, everything is random, there is no God, there is no spirituality, so I can do whatever I want. I can shape my life however I want. And we do not take into account maybe not exact destiny, but maybe some kind of, destiny that this is what is good for us. Maybe, the universe has something good, or maybe because we are in that way, like if we were born very muscular and it is easy for us to gain muscle, maybe we should, work out, and maybe we should not be like a marathon runner, because it will be bad for us, because we are genetically better at it. The same as with other capabilities. So that's why it is a true art of distinguishing what is important and what not, because you can read tons of books, try to remember everything, but if you do not have the holistic view of how it all works and how it is necessary, you will be a boring lecturer. You will be just stating some facts that everyone can search online, and you won't see the bigger picture. And this is the biggest problem of today's education and of everything, and of science, and of people, that we need to distinguish what is necessary and what's not. And that's why there is like a holistic problem, that we are taking too much when we don't need something. You know what I mean? And the same with information, the same with reading books.
Right.
And researching.
Right. You made a good point. I like how you put that. If you pick and choose what books you go through, and you'll skim the books, because there is a lot of books out there that's just a waste of time of reading. I've read plenty of books like that, and I was just like, man, this is crazy. I just asked Paul Wallace a couple of days ago, and he answered it on his YouTube channel. I asked him what is the most accurate Bible and what is the most corrupted Bible. And he didn't give me the answer for the corrupted, so I'm just waiting for him to come back to me on that. But I read that the New Jerusalem Bible Study Edition is a very good Bible to follow, because it gives you, like you talked about, the footnotes and all that stuff. And I've read the Bible so many times. That's probably the only book that I'll read constantly, because I actually have an 1873 version Bible right here in front of me in my study room. It's from the 1870s. It's been published. It's an old book. My mom bought it for me for my 40th birthday. So and I'm going through it on my YouTube channel now, page by page. I want to bring up two more things. I don't want to keep you too long, because I really do appreciate people's time, and I'm telling you, you've gained another follower just by what you're saying. I'm going to promote your work. I'm on Twitter Spaces a lot, hosting spaces, sharing stuff that I've learned, because I think that's the easiest and best way for me to promote my book. But because
I can share you a few PDFs outside of my book, because I was creating also other stuff, because most of the translations are in English. I sometimes, get the best text in English and in Polish to share on a YouTube video in the past, so I can share you a few more PDFs. And I have also from my high school like essays, like long essays on like prehistoric measures of the earth in the Great Pyramid, on the idealism that mind is over matter, etc. So I can send you. These are old ones, so some may be a little bit distorted. Maybe I've grown out of some ideas, but they are still valuable resources.
That in one of your videos you talked about Homo sapiens, and what I've learned, and this is going back to Atlantis, I learned from some people that from many scholars and independent historians, that the oldest Homo sapien bones that were found in Morocco, Africa, and they date them back possibly 300,000 plus years, right? And those bones possibly may have had what they consider today elongated heads. And I'm asking you this question because I actually told a lot of people that I was having discussion with you, and there are a few people that already had your book in the Twitter Spaces, and one of them asked me to ask you this question, right? He asked me, he says, to ask you, do you think the elongated heads were the Anunnaki in Atlantis?
That's a good question. I don't know if there were the Anunnaki themselves, but I think that these elongated skulls were connected to some kind of divine entities or human beings that wanted to be shaped like some gods, etc. So why not the Anunnaki? And I think that the most compelling example outside of the Parakas, but another very compelling example is the pharaoh Akhenaten and his family. I went when I was in high school just before the pandemic. I won't say the name because they will ban us, you know what I mean. But just before the pandemic, like 2 months before the pandemic, we went on a school trip to Berlin to the Neues Museum and the Pergamon, the most famous museums. Tons of beautiful stuff there. And you mentioned plenty of people mention ancient aliens are so stupid because they are not taking the facts, but actually everyone who went there, you see skulls like aliens. These are not just mere human skulls that are elongated like on the depictions of some pharaohs wearing the high crown, you know what I mean, but these are on the entirety deformed skulls which look exactly like from some sci-fi movie, like from an Alien or something. And this was all the family of the pharaoh Akhenaten, the pharaoh that made the biggest reforms and changes in the history of Egypt. He reformed the entire religion. He was hated for that. He was then killed for that, etc. And what is most interesting, because I thought to myself, if those schools, they are not elongated like the heads upwards, like the Paracas, but they are a little bit backwards, and they are shaped. It isn't only like, because Paracas schools are just probably human heads elongated, and we see that, just a normal school, but these schools, they were sculptures, the 3D, from ancient Egypt, from the times of the Akhenaten at that museum, and these schools were totally deformed in all the ways. They looked literally like some other beings, which I thought to myself, okay, maybe it is just an artistic expression, but where was the inspiration for that? Was it isn't beauty. It isn't like something that you would say like ideal human, etc. It is like humanoid, alien, or something like that. And what is interesting, I found that later that Akhenaten made that religious reform, but also he made a reform because before that, pharaohs were most often pictured and profiled like strong, bigger than slaves and normal humans, like they were beautiful, etc. But we see, for instance, some tombs of the pharaohs, some skulls of those pharaohs that they weren't looking like that. It was like Photoshop, that they wanted to present them the best they can before that. And Akhenaten made a decree that they want to portray everyone just as they are. They didn't want any filters. They just want true natural stuff, just the way they look like. So did Akhenaten and his family look like aliens? It may be the case, actually. And it isn't only about the skulls, actually, because if you see the Akhenaten and the family, I've got a graph in my book showing that. Oh, here I will be probably able to show you.
I see it. Yep. Yeah, I see that. I remember that one.
This is the family, Akhenaten, his wife, and his children. And it is not only about the heads, not only the elongated head, it's also head here profiled like an alien, like it is very slim, but also like there are bones, it is very long. And the entire body is, their hands are elongated, they are very slim. It is not like a human, hand. They are very slim, they are very long, and the babies or some children are not looking like children because the child isn't a miniature of human. You know what I mean? It isn't like me, but just a miniature version of it. Baby is a little bit different. It is chubby, it has different proportions, but babies here are looking like small aliens. Like, I don't know. And this is strange. And I think that it is the best case for the elongated skulls being at least an inspiration from
Right.
something outside of the human realm. And, maybe it was some kind of, genetic disease with this family, but it is everyone. The daughters of Akhenaten, the wife of Akhenaten, everyone is portrayed in a strange way. And even if this is all fake, that maybe Akhenaten looked normally, but where was the inspiration for their portrayal like
Exactly.
true aliens? So this is strange. And as you mentioned, those elongated skulls are found in many, many other areas. I think that most of them are human skulls actually, but they were modeling them on something. And people again are criticizing ancient aliens that it is bullshit at everything, but it is just imagination and speculation. Who were those beings? What they were modeling those elongated skulls and alien bodies on? The same, it is all about imagination. Plenty of people are, oh, Bigfoot, what a stupid belief, how people can believe in Bigfoot or Yeti. But actually, during the time of anatomically modern humans, we coexisted, our species, the same as we are today, coexisted with 5 other hominids. And they even coexisted with those hobbits, the Homo florencensis, who were like a meter tall. And all of those beings were not like we now coexisting with chimpanzees or orangutans, but these beings were hominids, so they were making tools, they were making shelters, creating stuff. Maybe even Neanderthals had their own religious beliefs and afterlife beliefs. So we coexisted with 5 different species. Why weren't we coexisting with giants? But we haven't found their remains yet. Why not with those elongated head beings, whoever they were? You know what I mean? We just need an imagination. And I mentioned this because it is very important. If we coexisted with hobbits, small beings, maybe we also coexisted with the giants, the Nephilim, or something like that. It is all about imagination. It is nothing extreme. It is all based on other cases, other things that are true, that we coexisted, for instance, with the hobbits. This is speculation based on some facts, but we do not know the truth yet.
You mentioned something. I wrote this down. This was
Mm-hmm.
I actually had a last question because that was the second to the
Okay.
last question, but I'm gonna get to this one before I ask the last question. Or two things. You mentioned Bigfoot. That's interesting because I actually did an article on Bigfoot. And if you go to the Epic of Gilgamesh, the description
Yes,
of Enkidu and Bigfoot is
exactly.
damn near the same, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And
This is another example.
yeah, exactly. And I did an article on that a couple of months ago. I can't remember when exactly, but I put the correlation together because I've read Michael Cramo's book Forbidden Archaeology
Mm-hmm.
that he did with Richard Thompson, and he
Yes,
mentions the
yes.
Yeti and Bigfoot and all that stuff in there. And I actually asked him personally when I had him on a podcast discussion about Enkidu and Bigfoot, and he answered it. And he says there's a possibility. But the reason why I
Mm-hmm.
bring
Of
this up
course.
is because you mentioned the word human. Now, when you read Michael Cramo's book about forbidden archaeology, he likes to use the word anatomically human instead
Mm-hmm.
of human. So my question to you is, just like civilization is, what is a human to you? What is the criteria to be considered a human? Because if we look at the Australopithecus ramidus, the Australopithecus afarensis, if we look at the Cro-Magnon people, Homo erectus, the first species of
Mm-hmm.
Homo sapiens, they're all different species, but
Mm-hmm.
they're
Yes.
considered humans. So with the elongated heads that you spoke about, the skulls being different, the facial being different, the arms being longer and slender and stuff, could they still be considered humans, or would you consider them
Mm-hmm.
something different?
The answer, and I think that I agree with that, which is the basic answer, is the genetics. And there is a huge misconception because they are telling us, oh, we have 99.9% the same DNA as a chimpanzee, right? So we are most probably like cousins or something. But
Mhm.
actually, we have 40% the same DNA with bananas.
Yeah,
So this is a huge
I
misconception
say that.
about the
I say that a
about the
lot too.
DNA. that the percentage doesn't mean anything, because all of the species on Earth are actually similar. If you compare even humans to dogs, you know, the
Yeah.
basic stuff about the vessels, about the heart, all is almost the same. So this is the biggest misconception, because people say, wow, we are from apes because we have 99%. It is a huge misconception. But what matters is, you know, how the DNA appears, because, you know, the genetic potential of the genes, this person being the same, is only in a potential manner. But
Yeah.
we know we divide anatomically modern humans from apes or from hominids, because we know that there was a prehistoric of chromosomes. We have 23 pairs of chromosomes, and this is very important because chromosomes appear after every multiplication, before every multiplication division of the cells. So every time our cells are being recycled in our bodies, there appear chromosomes, and we have 23 pairs of chromosomes. Other apes like chimpanzees have 24 pairs, so one pair more. Hominids most probably had a pair more. And we know because we see our chromosomes like are merged together, like they're deformed. They aren't like natural chromosomes, they are deformed. And scientists, geneticists found out that there was probably about 200,000 years ago, which is a conservative estimate. It can be like the Moroccan skeletons 300,000, but conservative estimate 200,000 years, anatomically modern humans appeared through a fusion of chromosomes. I described it in my book. And we know because we see those chromosomes that were like the before ape chromosomes that were put together. It is like a mutation, but mutation often leads to cancer or some disease. This fusion of chromosomes is like 24 pairs in an ape, some chromosomes being put together, being fused together, and after that we have not an ape or a hominid, but a much more advanced being, which may point to a creationist view. Maybe not God, but maybe the Anunnaki experimenting with some hominids like Enkidu, changing the DNA and making people more intelligent. And it is very important because we know from biology, for instance, if human beings have one less pair of chromosomes, there, for instance, have some not disease but genetical conditions like the Down syndrome or something. I don't know if it is in English the same, but in Polish it is Down syndrome. But I don't remember. There are plenty of different, if you have too much chromosomes, if you have too less chromosomes, but you often get a distorted human being, not a better, like a superhuman after that. But here there's an example that 200,000 years, some hominid being or an ape or something similar to us but different, something much less primitive, had a completely random accidental, like the same, almost like for the creation of the universe out of nothing. So the probability is like there is a tornado or hurricane through a scrapyard and there is a Boeing, you know what I mean? So there is almost no possibility for that. And this should lead for something to be distorted, like less of the being, but actually it made us much more intelligent. And we know because we can analyze those chromosomes, this fusion made us much more intelligent. It made the prefrontal cortex work more than in other species before. It also made us be capable of expressing higher emotions like compassion, etc. So a completely random genetical fusion led to a much more advanced human being. So we know that distinguishes us from the previous hominids. But you know how this fusion appeared? This is a question. Maybe it was, some people say God, maybe randomness, or maybe some outside like extraterrestrials or some other beings. But this distinguishes us. We see that we have a pair of chromosomes less than the closest like species to us. And that's why it is a misconception, because at the same time we share 99% of the same genes.
Right. I'm glad you answered that perfectly. I like how you put that. That's very interesting because when it comes to being a human, we're all going to have our own definition, just like with civilization, with what we consider a civilization. You said that it could have been writing, And if writing wasn't the civilization that brought them to be, it could have been something else because writing might have not been important to them. And you said because earlier you said they probably remembered it. Now, this is what I'm doing us some research on. And I'm doing this research on this for a personal reason. So I have a son. My son is 5 years old and he has autism. And he's five, like I say, he's 5 years old, but he has a hard time speaking, right?
Mm-hmm.
He can speak, but only me and my wife can understand him because kids speak a certain way. Well, he can read. And when I mean that he can read, I can pick any of those books that's right behind you right now and place it in front of him and he can read it at that
Mm-hmm.
level. Okay. And because of that, and my wife's also a special needs teacher for a middle school. So she just graduated with her master's and everything. She teaches special needs, and she was actually the first one, or she was the one who caught the idea or got whiff of him having autism, right? And I didn't believe it because I didn't see it, and of course I'm not around it like that. But as he got older, and when he got to 5 years old, I noticed his intelligence. And I noticed it to the point where, like I said, he could pick up a book and read it. Or what he's doing now is he's trying to fry his own eggs. Like he's very independent. He knows how to
Mm-hmm.
get the eggs, he knows how to put the butter in the skillet, he knows how to crack open the egg and put it in there. This is a 5 year old that's doing this, right? I had a TV in his room one time and I didn't have a controller, and he would see me press this little button on the back to turn it on because once it turns off, I don't want him to have a remote to turn it back on. Well, there was a few times when I would go in his room and he would watch TV. And I was like, how did he turn it on? He doesn't have the remote. And I caught him one day going back there pressing the button and maneuvering himself how to turn on this stuff. So that caught my intelligence on there too. Then he started how can I say, started fixing things. I bought him like a little play car thing and he started working on the engine. It's like a little model size little car thing. He works on the engine, the headlights, and all this other stuff. And he started remembering this stuff. And I was like, wow, this kid's really intelligent, right? So what I started to do in this, I started researching autism. And what I've learned that is that there are individuals who have autism, but also has savant syndrome. And these are the individuals that I believe have really, really took our civilizations to a whole different level. Because there was a time when, in our hunter and gathering days, or at least this is what I've read, is that if Greeks have wrote about this, the Spartans, talked about it and stuff, or at least they say that's what the Spartans talked about. But there's these theories that when these kids had these or these adults had these babies and their kids were disabled, or there's something deformed about them or whatever, they would basically in their own way get rid of the child, throw them off a cliff, or sacrifice them to the gods or something like that. That's just part of our history, right? And I believe
Mm-hmm.
once we started nurturing these individuals that were essentially being first, I hate to say it like this, but killed off because of their deformities or whatever. When we started nurturing that, I believe that's when we started getting the calculations with mathematics. That's when we started learning about visual aids and mostly just mathematics in general, because mathematically you can prove anything mathematically. And math doesn't change, at least on our earth. Our physics and math is about the same. It's a universal language, right? However, when you go outside of Earth, that doesn't always apply, right? Because the physics is going to change, of course, right? And we don't know everything, and we're still adding things to the periodic table and stuff like that. So when I looked into savant syndrome, I really feel like savant syndrome is a key to our civilization, because there are individuals who can do math faster than calculators.
Mm-hmm.
There are individuals. There was this one guy, I believe he flew over New York, I want to say on a 15-minute flight over New York, and drew the canvas of New York perfectly, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes,
Better
yes.
than what is told on Google, right? And showed on Google in some cases. So it makes me think, if we research more about savant syndrome, will we understand how some of this technology came to be? Because when you read the Bible, you read about the Ezekiel having a vision of these wheels, right? Because he's in a dreamlike state and he has that. Nikola Tesla talks about how some of his inventions came from him having a dreamlike meditative state, He's
Mhm.
very familiar with 369. We all know that. This guy was on board with that. Albert Einstein said he would do this. I can't remember. I can't remember who it was, and I don't want to mess up the name, but there was an individual who would hold like a metal ball in their hand. And when they fell asleep and they got into their deep sleep, the ball would drop and it would wake them up. In the middle of that, they will write whatever they was dreaming in that moment. So they don't forget it. So I
Mhm.
feel like our minds, especially with the elongated heads, think about it. We talked about the elongated head and we talked about advanced civilizations. What's the best way, in a concrete way, not abstract, but concrete way, represent somebody with intelligence? And I think that the modification of the
Mhm.
brain could be that, right? Because if you look at
Mhm.
some of these
Yes,
individuals,
maybe yes.
right, it makes sense, right? If you think about it, right?
That's a good lead.
Yeah, and that's why, and I really think about it because all I've heard you say today was knowledge and information is important. And these savants had this to the point where they wouldn't forget. You literally said that writing may have never been needed because they remembered it. Why would you
Yes,
need to write something down if your brain is already calculated,
exactly.
right? So I think, like I said, and I'm very grateful for this conversation, Alexander. I really do appreciate this. The information you gave me was great. And when I say I'm going to buy both copies of your book.